Welcome to the graveyard shift, as I call it, of the conference. My name is Paul Goodwin, and I teach at University of the Arts London, where I'm also director of Train Research Centre. I also happen to be the co-lead investigator of the World in Public Cultures project with my colleague Ming Tiampo, who just moderated a great panel on the complexities of counter-histories just a few moments ago. So following that session on counter-histories, this evening's panel will address the question of public culture. It feels like the present moment is really an important time to consider the question of public culture. Public culture, at least in its more progressive guise, has been under constant attack. And it seemed to me, following decades of cuts and austerity regimes imposed by neoliberal authorities around the world, this calculated assault on our museums, galleries, cultural institutions, and educational curricula has been followed more recently by the intensification of the so-called culture wars and attacks on expressions of cultural difference by populist and authoritarian regimes. Public culture has become or is a site of struggle with huge stakes for all of us who are invested in worlded, decolonized futures. Stuart Hall urgently articulated the stakes of the struggles over culture as a site of contestation, negotiation, and resistance, saying in relation to popular culture, for example, quote, "Popular culture is one of the sites where the struggle for and against a culture of the powerful is engaged. It is also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle. It's the arena of consent and resistance." Unquote. So to paraphrase another intellectual guide from myself, this time from Europe, Michel Foucault, from one of his famed lecture series at the Collège de France, it feels like we're in a moment when public culture must be defended. Public culture must be defended. So the papers presented in this panel by our esteemed panelists, which I'll introduce in a second, will address and unpack some of the complexities and thinking through what's at stake in the debate over public culture by drawing on the work of Caribbean thinkers such as Hall, Édouard Glissant, and Sylvia Wynter. And they'll be doing so across the fields of visual culture, radical pedagogy, monuments and counter-monuments, museums, and museology. So the format for the panel will be that there'll be each presentation, which will be pre-recorded, will be 15 minutes from each panelist, one after the other, followed by a few questions from myself, just to open up the conversation, and then we'll open up for the Q&A with the audience. So can I also remind all of you to please add your questions and comments in the Q&A box, so that we can hear from you. So let me introduce now our first speaker, a good friend of mine, and a really important curator and writer, intellectual, Ghislaine Tawadros. Her paper is called Detour to the Imaginary, Stuart Hall's Writings on the Visual Arts and Culture. Ghislaine Tawadros is the chief executive of DAX, the Artist Visual Rights Organization, and co-director of the Art 360 Foundation. She's written extensively on contemporary art and curated several international exhibitions. She's being quite modest there, I think. She was the founding director of Innova and is currently chair of the Stuart Hall Foundation. Her most recent book, anthology, The Sphinx Contemplating Napoleon, Global Perspectives on Contemporary Art and Difference, is published by Bloomsbury. So can we have Ghislaine's paper, please? Thank you.
Stuart Hall's writings on politics, race, and media are familiar to readers throughout the world, but less well known are his writings on the visual arts and culture. And yet Stuart's engagement with the visual arts can be traced back to his early reviews of exhibitions in the 1950s in the journal Universities and New Left Review. However, it wasn't until the 1980s that Stuart's involvement with the visual arts, and in particular with a younger generation of Black British artists, filmmakers, and thinkers, deepened and translated into a series of close collaborations and friendships, and a significant practical commitment to two arts organisations that he chaired throughout the 1990s and noughties, Autograph Association of Black Photographers, and INNOVA, Institute of International Visual Arts. This afternoon, I want to explore why Stuart Hall immersed himself in what he describes as the radically different intellectual and aesthetic space of the visual imaginary. The project with which he identified was one in which diaspora artists, filmmakers, and thinkers in Britain sought to, quote, challenge certain erasures and marginalizations inscribed in the visual field itself, to try to establish a certain presence within the frame, to come into the field of vision, end of quote. As Stuart Hall emphasized, this project was not a simple strategy of reversal, putting in place of the bad old essential white subject, the new essentially black subject, but rather opened up a continuous critical discourse about the forms of representation, the subjects of representation, above all, the regimes of representation. For many who know Stuart's work through his engagement with cultural studies or race or politics, Stuart's involvement with the visual may seem to be peripheral to his other intellectual preoccupations. But I would argue that Stuart's engagement with the visual was a critical part of his intellectual armor, and in some instances helped frame his insights into race and politics. If you want to learn more or see how difference operates inside people's heads, wrote Stuart, you have to go to art, you have to go to culture, to where people imagine, where they fantasize, where they symbolize. You have to make the detour from the language of straight description to the language of the imaginary. In 1988, Stuart participated in a conference, Black Film, British Cinema, at the ICA in London, which had been convened by Kabina Mercer. Stuart's paper for the conference, entitled New Ethnicities, set about to describe a significant shift that he had identified in Black cultural politics between two moments. The first moment was, said Stuart, when the term Black was coined as a way of referencing the common experience of racism and marginalization in Britain, and came to provide the organizing category of a new politics of resistance. In this moment, the struggle for Black people was to come into representation, demanding the right as Black artists and cultural workers to represent themselves, and at the same time, challenging the marginalization, stereotyping, and fetishization of Black people in white mainstream culture. This moment, Stuart describes, was one that was aimed at changing the relations of representation. The shift which Stuart identifies emerging in the late 1980s is one which moves from a struggle over the relations of representation to the politics of representation itself. And the boundary between these two moments is marked by what Stuart calls the end of innocence, or the end of the innocent notion of the essential Black subject. From this point on, it became necessary to recognize, first of all, the extraordinary diversity of subjective positions, social experiences, and cultural identities which constitute the category Black. And secondly, to recognize that Black is essentially a politically and culturally constructed category, which cannot be grounded in a set of fixed transcultural or transcendental racial categories, and which therefore has no guarantees in nature. It also means that we have to recognize that the central issue of race is constantly crossed and recrossed by categories of class, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. And importantly, it's through the lens of the work of Black artists and filmmakers in the 1980s that Stuart Hall identifies not only the end of the essential Black subject and the ascendancy of the politics of representation, but also the move to decouple whiteness from Britishness. And in the terms of Paul Gilroy's seminal book from 1987, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, it meant putting the Black in the Union Jack, recognizing how the presence of Black people in Britain has transformed Britain inexorably. To quote Stuart again, the decoupling of ethnicity from the violence of the state is implicit in some of the new forms of cultural practice that are going on in films like Passion and Handsworth Songs. We are beginning to think about how we represent a non-coercive and a more diverse conception of ethnicity, to set against the embattled, hegemonic conception of Englishness, which under Thatcherism stabilizes so much of the dominant political and cultural discourses, and which, because it is hegemonic, does not represent itself as an ethnicity at all. To understand how visual culture and the work of visual artists and filmmakers operates as a critical part of Stuart Hall's intellectual toolkit, it's worth going back to the 1970s to consider how race and racial politics in Britain acted as the lens through which Stuart is able to understand a profound shift in British politics at the end of the 1970s and early 1980s. In the 1970s, Stuart was working as a professor at the Centre for Cultural Studies in Birmingham, where he and his colleagues carried out research into race, mugging, and the criminal justice system, which resulted in a book published in 1978 called Policing the Crisis. The book was produced in the context of a deepening political and social crisis in the 1970s in Britain, and the rise of a new right-wing free market politics, which was spearheaded by the conservative politician Margaret Thatcher. The book is a forensic study into the different contributing factors which gave rise to a moral panic about mugging, crime statistics, media reporting, the courts, police attitudes to young men in Britain's cities, all of which contributed to this moral panic and provided the opportunity for the new right in Britain to assert itself as the means by which order and authority could be restored. It's important to emphasize that the deepening political and social crisis at that time was not all about race, but race was a recurring motif, and race and crime was at the center of what Thatcherism, Stuart coined the phrase, could focus on as a way to try to roll back the social democratic consensus in Western Europe in the post-war period. By studying the rise of new right politics and the increasing authoritarianism of the state through the lens of race, Stuart was able to identify before many others how Margaret Thatcher's rise was not just a political victory for the new right, but critically how it marked a profound change in political culture and marked a shift to a new historical conjuncture. As Stuart correctly identified, Thatcherism was not simply a British manifestation. It was the beginning of globalization and a new stage in the global capitalist economy. A few years after the ICA Black Film British Cinema Conference in 1988, Stuart Hall became chair of Autograph, the Association of Black Photographers, and not long after, he became chair of INIVA, the Institute of International Visual Arts, two organizations with which he remained closely associated until the early 90s, and the establishment of a new purpose-built building designed by David Adjaye to house both Autograph and INIVA. In the intervening years, Stuart's close relations and collaborations with Black artists and filmmakers and curators, including David A. Bailey, Sonia Boyce, Mark Seeley, and myself, continued to grow. And key amongst those collaborations was the one with the artist Isaac Julien, which endured over a number of decades. Stuart writes in his essay in Isaac Julien's MoMA exhibition catalogue from 2013, quote, "Over the course of a friendship of more than 30 years, I have been in conversation with Isaac Julien about, and even occasionally played, a small walk-on role in the remarkable body of work that has precipitated his rise to international stature in the art world. This has involved listening, discussing, commenting on projects and scripts, sharing ideas, and the hilarious anecdotes that enliven a rich and valued friendship." Stuart and Isaac first met in the 1980s when Isaac was part of the filmmaking collective Sankofa, which made Territories, which explored intersections among political, sexual, and racial domains, and The Passion of Remembrance from 1986, which he publicly defended when it was attacked for being too experimental by a group of Black intellectuals. He read a few lines in Looking for Langston, Isaac's film about Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance, and briefly appeared in The Attendant from 1993, and was involved in Isaac's film about Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, in which he is in conversation with Françoise Vergès. In the last years of Stuart's life, he and his wife, the academic Catherine Hall, were in discussion with Isaac and his partner, Mark Nash, about his project Playtime, an installation work about contemporary capitalism. As Stuart writes, these exchanges, quote, included at one end an effort to identify the distinctive characteristics of contemporary global capitalism, and at the other, the problem of how to visualize an abstraction. I want to end with a quote from Stuart's essay in the catalogue to Isaac's MoMA exhibition. Quote, I urged Isaac to position the work firmly in what was most novel, different, and distinctive about global capitalism today, still perhaps generically governed by Marx's fundamental laws, but now relentlessly global and transnational, driven by finance capital in the search for short-term profits, embedded in institutions, processes, structures, relationships, and ideologies, characteristic of the new liberal market society, free enterprise version of capitalism that emerged in the 1980s. This free market system has created yawning gaps worldwide between rich and poor and between developed and developing societies, along with staggering accumulations of corporate and personal wealth. It's produced greater unevenness of development and more multiplying interdependencies than ever seen before. It sponsored the wave of post-war global migration that contradictorily connects the offices of the global super-rich, themselves now transcontinental and ethnically diverse, and their migrant night cleaners. A pervasive, ruthlessly competitive and privatized common sense has penetrated popular consciousness, corrupted business practices and public life, and invaded and transformed every sphere of life, not least the global art market, with an ensuing impact on artists and their work that first attracted Isaac's attention. At the very end of the essay, Stuart reflects on the distinctive nature of the visual as a mode of thinking. Quote, confronted by another mode of thought, made me acutely aware how radically different are the visual languages in which Isaac thinks and the critical, discursive, and analytic work I do. It made me reconsider, especially, the limits of the way I think. I think in a linear, sequential way, one idea provoking another. Isaac is often thinking about the same problems, but his thought has entered a space or mode where ideas like mine develop a link along what we may call a horizontal axis, immediately trigger or translate into an associative or analogical set of images, visual sequences, and narrative devices along a vertical axis which obey a logic of their own, are in no sense simply illustrative. This is the visual imaginary at work.
Thank you so much for that beautiful paper, Ghislaine, as always. I think it really helps to kind of set the stage for much of the discussions to come in terms of thinking about how thinkers such as Stuart Hall was really influenced by the visual and worked with the visual, and indeed made really important interventions into the politics of representation, as you described, as you talked about, and actually advocated for visual culture and for art as a site of struggle, site of negotiation within the kind of historical conjunctures that he talked about. So let's move on to our second paper, which is again extremely exciting to welcome Malini Guha. And her paper is called Contemporary Imaginings of Militant Educational Practices. Malini Guha is an associate professor of film studies at Carleton University in Canada. She is a settler of South Asian descent, and her research interests are expansive, extending from a long-standing commitment to thinking and writing about film and the city, as well as diasporic and post-colonial cinemas, to more recent turns toward the subject of world cinema and other moving image practices, including public projection. Her essays have been published in a number of journals and number of journals, such as the Feminist Media Histories and the Journal of British Cinema and Television. Her first monograph, From Empires to the World, Migrant London and Paris in Cinema, by Edinburgh University Press, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2015, is a study of cinematic London and Paris from the perspective of migration, globalization, and the end of empire in a British context. So can we have Malini's presentation? Thank you.
In an essay titled Cultural Studies and Its Theoretical Legacies, Stuart Hall famously makes the claim for the modesty of theory and for a recognition of its limited ability to affect change in the material world, while also hanging on to the idea that theory is of immense value to any political practice, including a pedagogical one, as the insights theory brings to such a practice cannot be arrived at any other way, as Hall puts it. I've been thinking about how this tension between theory and ideas on the one hand and a political practice on the other is activated in a number of pedagogically informed responses to the events of 2020, by which I mean the murder of Breonna Taylor and the lynching of George Floyd at the hands of the police and the summer of rebellion that ensued across Turtle Island and elsewhere. These responses included the making and sharing of the anti-racist reading and viewing list and institutional turns to the tenets of equity, diversity, and inclusion in bids to address systemic racism. What is at stake here is the question of traction, or how we might connect ideas to material realities in order to transform them. So in this short talk today, I want to think with Hall about this long-standing tension and its specific reactivation this time by concentrating on the frenzy of reading and viewing lists in 2020 and considering them in conjunction with two artworks that bear some relationship to the list as form. These works are Human _ 3.0 Reading List by Black American filmmaker and artist Colleen Smith, and a film called The Inheritance by Black American filmmaker Ephraim Asili. So let me take you back to June 2020 and to the anti-racism reading and viewing lists that spread out across social media platforms. Lauren Michelle Jackson argues that these lists are mired in zoological modes of consumption. As she says, if you read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye to root out your so-called unconscious biases, then questions of form and style are firmly pushed aside. Instead, if you want to read a novel, read a damn novel like it's a novel. The Zoological Gaze has a long legacy in a cinematic context, including histories of ethnographic filmmaking, where images of Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color were, as Fatima Tobin Rooney puts it, taken for real, and this tendency persists in these forms of listing. The lists and guides on how not to be racist further rest on a fantasy that reading and viewing necessarily leads to becoming. What these lists promise is traction, grounded in the belief that ideas gathered from these activities will stick. But as Hall notes in the essay I've been referencing, it is the decentered nature of culture that makes it difficult to forge direct links between it and other structures. And beyond this, we know anecdotally that sometimes the books ordered on the basis of these lists were never even picked up, let alone read. As Hall observes in this same essay, metaphors are, quote, serious things. They affect one's practice, end quote. I'm going to now turn to a set of metaphors concerning pedagogy and the promise of traction that lay a foundation for my discussion of the two artworks I mentioned at the start of this talk. In a manifesto that Smith wrote to accompany her reading list, she declares, Black people are at war without the proper armor. We require inoculations that repel the seductions of corporate servitude. She offers her list, quote, in the hopes that through study and conversation, exchange occurs and the inoculation sticks, end quote. And her use of study seems to draw from Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's notion of Black study without pause or end, a form of study that is with and for others. Theorist and filmmaker Kodjo Ishan has also referred to Black art and education as forms of self-defense. These metaphors direct our attention towards educational models rooted in the need for protection and fortification against anti-Blackness writ large, while also serving as a preparation for time to come. They further suggest that not all pedagogies are for everyone, and we can draw upon these metaphors to interrupt the universalist and homogeneous currents of institutional-led imaginings of equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as list-based pedagogies. These metaphors orient ideas towards a political praxis of survival and of world building, and as such, they ask us to attend to their materiality. And I borrow this idea from Catherine McKittrick, who urges us to consider the materiality of our metaphors. So I'm going to connect these metaphors more directly now to the works by Smith and Asili. Smith's project began as drawings of the covers of 14 books in 2015. The project later expanded to 57 drawings and was exhibited at the Art Institute of Chicago in 2017. So this project constitutes Smith's engagement with Sylvia Wynter's call to imagine a new praxis of being human, one that parts ways from man one and man two, figures that thrive on accumulation, as Catherine McKittrick puts it. This new praxis of being human acknowledges that we, following Frantz Fanon, are hybrid beings, both bios and mythos. Asili's film, released in 2020, charts the formation of a fictional Black collective that begins with Julian's inheritance of his grandmother's home in West Philadelphia and her archive of records, books, photographs, and other ephemera. His partner Gwen helps him transform the house into a commune known as the House of Ubuntu, which, as Sarah Ty Black explains, means universal boundedness. This commune is made up of Black artists, activists, and educators, and they engage in an extended process of study, in addition to invited speakers, including the very real members of the Philadelphia-based liberation group, MOVE. So Smith and Asili share a preoccupation with the question of the inheritance of a Black radical tradition, from which a praxis of being human can come into being alongside collective forms of living and learning. Their works are grounded in the desire for traction, but they do not envision a direct relationship between learning and being. Instead, they give us tools and imagine the conditions where such an endeavor becomes a genuine possibility. Smith's decision to draw the book covers of her list is both a method of iteration and one of translation. In interviews, Smith situates the drawings of covers as an aesthetic translation of the durational experience of reading a book. Smith also argues that looking at these drawings might stimulate a durational experience for viewers who might be inclined to slow down and take in images that are radically different from the high definition imagery of the digital era. In aiming to facilitate a durational encounter, Smith's list can be situated in opposition to what Elena Gorfinkel argues is the limited attentional real estate of the list, and especially in its digital variation, which is geared towards the fatigued, enervated, click-hungry. The stakes of becoming in this context are far greater than the quest to become anti-racist. By Wynter, Smith's list is geared towards the making of a new genre of being human, grounded in what she refers to as a sustainable ontology. However, Smith's work is more than a list of foundational texts. The formal elements of the list further direct us towards the interrelated actions of durational encounters and iteration as models for inoculation, conceived of as a method of learning and making, and also as an aspiration, where these methods might feed into a political practice. In an interview, Asili describes his longstanding practice of collecting books, music, and other ephemera geared towards the making of a physical archive of Black thought. He argues that the presence of these items is nearly as important as their content, and he talks about the energy he draws from their presence and from being able to see the passage of time on their surfaces. He explains that he wanted to translate this experience into filmic form, and The Inheritance is a prime example. The film is filled with moments where we are shown items from Julian's newly inherited collection in what signifies as a direct address to viewers, where we are granted a cinematic experience of presence and sensation, where we too can see the marks of time on the text and take in their textures. So like Smith, Asili explores time-based encounters with the objects, but his methods also move into the terrain of iteration and repetition as performance. There is a scene early on in the film where Gwen and Julian take turns reading aloud from Ujamaa, Essays on Socialism by Julius K. Nyerere, as Gwen puts it, in an effort to re-educate ourselves. The passages they read outline the parameters of an African socialism based on the making of communities and of shared land. Reading aloud in this context takes on a performative quality as the characters read for each other and for us, the viewers. Julian also reads certain passages more than once as a performance of internalization directed at the audience, so that we too might try to remember what it is that we are hearing. Performance is positioned as a method of inoculation and one of collective learning in various ways throughout the film. So as Julian reads from the text, Gwen puts up a photograph of Shirley Chisholm, and later the camera pans down, just as Gwen finishes reading to unveil her t-shirt. There is then a cut to an extended sequence of archival footage of Chisholm, where she advocates for coalition building as the only way to challenge dominant structures of oppression. So in a gesture of montage, the characters encourage viewers to draw connections between a work of African socialism and the vision of an African American woman fighting for change within a capitalist and inherently anti-Black system. The pedagogical framing of the sequence activates a sense of diasporic time that is constellation-like in its configuration and raises possibilities concerning the formation of curriculums geared towards self-education as a method of inoculation. So we can view the reading of Ujamaa as a practice of iteration. The reading of the text signifies as a moment of performance, and its positioning alongside archival footage of Chisholm potentially provokes new ways of thinking about both. The second and final aspect of these works I want to talk about is their emphasis on the significance of space making as a pedagogical practice. So in interviews, Smith envisions a spatial counterpart to her work, which is a reading room for Black activists filled with books from her reading list, a space for them to rest and recuperate after a protest or fortify themselves before attending one. So Smith continually suggests that a list of books is not enough. We must also create the conditions and spaces within which durational encounters with them can be staged and the possibility of traction can emerge. The Inheritance also includes numerous scenes of characters discussing and debating ideas, where we can see the figures befriend each other and, just as significantly, learn to befriend ideas. As Avery Gordon and Celine Condorelli observe, the practice of friendship can become a modality of social change as one labors for and with others. So we watch the characters learn to translate what they read and what they perform into the making of a space dedicated to the preservation and self-care of Black people. Space making itself is situated as a pedagogical practice in the film. So to evoke Lauren Michelle Jackson once more, I have tried to read these works by Smith and Asili as works of art in attending to their form and aesthetics. But I am also reading them in a manner that is indebted to a long tradition in film studies, where cinema is thought to assume a pedagogical function in eras marked by upheaval and transition. If we return to Hall, his notion of the modesty of theory hinges on the question of traction, and more precisely on how ideas often fail to gain traction in the material world while also remaining vital to the formation of a politics. Smith and Asili employ methods involving duration, iteration, the making of space, among other methods I don't have time to talk about today, that are made to the measure of two different mediums of artistic expression. But the similarities traced across these works is illuminating in their shared suggestion that one must translate theory or other educational materials into embodied practices if traction is what is desired. So the possibility I want to hang on to in this time, one involves the question of how we might rethink what it means to acquire knowledge, takes me to examples of artworks that are invested in pedagogical questions. As I have gleaned from thinking alongside artists, who are developing art-based pedagogical modes or resources, it is especially significant for those of us who teach art in a studies context to consider what modes of pedagogy artworks themselves to suggest, ones that we might take up in translated form, and not in a bid to turn everyone into a practitioner, but to take seriously the idea that something has to happen between the moment one reads or views or listens, and then tries to channel what has been learned into a political practice. That something is an act or gesture of translation. And it is my contention that this method of reading might help us to see artworks as doing something more than reflecting or refracting realities. They can tether us to the worlds we currently inhabit and help us envision and work towards the ones we want to build.
Okay, more fire. Yeah, another fantastic paper. Thank you so much, Melina. There's so much there to unpack. I think I would pick out this idea that you following, I mean, in the last session, the question of method came up again, and following on from Catherine's brilliant keynote, this question of methods and how we translate, how we kind of read in a more through notions of sociality and collectivity really come through in this. And I think when you talk about the need to translate theory into embodied practices is something definitely Stuart Hall connects with Ghislaine's paper about Stuart's work with artists. He understood that you need to work with the visual, with artists, in order to translate theory into those kinds of more political sites of contestation. So, okay, great. So our next paper is also looks as though it's going to be fire. It's by Julia M. Horry, called Caribbean Counter Monuments, A Visual History of Dissent. Julia M. Horry is an incoming lecturer in post-colonial literature in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge. After completing a doctorate in English with a certificate in African American Studies at Princeton University, she held a Fletcher Jones postdoctoral fellowship in contemporary literature at the California Institute of Technology. Continually inspired and informed by her interdisciplinary training in literatures and visual cultures of the Caribbean and African diaspora, Horry researches and teaches at the intersections of literature, race, and theories of architecture and space. So let's have Julia's paper, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to the conversation to follow. Early on in his essay collection, Caribbean Discourse, Édouard Glissant unfurls a living, spasmodic topography of colonial and post-colonial Martinique. A tangle of green which the roads still do not penetrate, vines into the arid grooves of pineapple plots, into the undulations of cane fields, the yawn of the setting sun on a ruined great house, a field of leaves soaked in blood, decaying factories, and the agitated frontier of the beach. The paths of enslavement, rebellion, and indentureship coexist in the landscape with ongoing labor strikes, land seizures, and the expansion of tourist infrastructures. Distinctions between the markers of human and environmental time, between built and natural features collapse, giving way to a collective sensorium of historical activations. Glissant writes, "So history is spread out beneath this surface, from the mountains to the sea, from north to south, from the forest to the beaches, maroon resistance and denial, entrenchment and endurance, the world beyond and dream. Our landscape is its own monument. Its meaning can only be traced on the underside. It is all history." Out of this dense network of ruinate and emergent forms, Glissant assembles a capacious vision of public memory and monumentality. As we survey our inherited memorial landscape, overburdened with the paranoid monoliths of imperial nostalgia, Glissant returns our attention to the deep and archipelagic cross-fertilizations of our collective descent. Inspired by this alternative vision, as it is brought to bear on escalating calls for the removal of imperial statues, the reckoning with institutional legacies, and the redistribution of public attention to underrepresented histories, I turn to the radical aesthetics of the Caribbean and the broader African diaspora. Grappling with the monumental remains of imperial world building, colonialism, and slavery, my presentation traces the underside of history via the counter-monumental methodologies of three Black multidisciplinary artists, Hugh Locke, Levon Bell, and Kara Walker, as they excavate the enduring paradigms and mobile artifacts of our troubled post-emancipation present. As I explore, these works avail us to three distinct but allied theoretical and tactile approaches to counter-monumentality, which I believe may be fruitfully characterized as ornamental spoliation, incendiary architecture, and monumental misremembering. Read together, their transformative processes devise a material language through which the transatlantic counter-monument can speak. Hugh Locke's use of mixed media in sculpture, painting, and photography studies the naturalized memorial landscapes of empire to draw out the composite mythologies and paradoxical textures of their artifice. This is abundantly evidenced in the Guyanese-British artist's multidisciplinary maximalist approach to the iconography of imperial monuments. Since the 90s, Locke's practice has reimagined the narrative and aesthetic possibilities of public statues across many historical contexts in Britain, the Caribbean, and the US. Ornamented with and simultaneously degraded by multiple formal processes and residues, his work deploys an aesthetics of excess to confront the austere gray slabs that preside over civic spaces, performing quiet dignity as if to pardon their crimes. In Locke's diverse practice, massive perforated cardboard portraits of the royal family meet the photographs and maquettes of monumental imperial figures, masked and painted, dripping layers of bright baubles. The use of cheap ephemera such as metal trinkets, ribbon, badges, plastic beads, swords, and flowers override and undermine the enduring authority of Queen Elizabeth, Captain Cook, and Sir George White. Locke commits himself to a layered practice that he refers to as mindful vandalism. Encrusted with mass-produced treasures, their vast accumulation of wealth and growth in public notoriety suffocates them with the morbid growths of imperial spoils and colonial spoliations. In all their claustrophobic glory, the work insistently reminds us that it was the environmental degradation and social decay of the enslaved plantation and the colonized village, each, in Fanon's words, a world without spaciousness that gave picturesque order to the wide boulevards and open squares of metropolitan space, where imperial monuments live. Particularly where it concerns the photographs of sculptures vandalized by drawing and tactile collage, it is not only the figure depicted in the image that necessitates confrontation, but the very technologies of image making. In his 2006 restoration series, Locke punctures photographs of the statues of Edmund Burke, Edward Colston, and Edward VII, overwhelming their forms with masses of string, artificial foliage, small daggers, and lengths of fake gold coins. In the process, the individual figures are shrunken and concealed, while the instrument of the monument, a penetrative technology of imperial space and memory, is rendered hypervisible. Locke's contrapuntal restorations demand that we notice again all the statues so familiar they are invisible. The armor of their desecration, especially in the case of Edward VII's overgrowth of foliage, reminiscent of adaptable military camouflage techniques towards the inverse effect of spectacular visibility, highlight the ruinous imperial ideologies hiding in plain sight. The delicate yet cumulatively constraining honor of the trinkets they wear deploy the soft power of monumentality, weaponized against itself. Though Locke has been commissioned to produce a number of public works in his long career working as an artist in the UK, no British town or city has yet instrumentalized his proposals to engage with existing monuments. In 2018, the director of Icon Gallery told ArtNet News that it had secured planning permission for Locke to temporarily transform the statue of Queen Victoria in Birmingham's Queen Square into a voodoo queen, but the project has yet to be realized. Thus, Locke's ornamental spoliations remain material articulations of the subjunctive mood. Levon Bell is a US Virgin Islands-based artist working at the intersection of forms and mediums, drawing from the fictions and frictions of colonial materiality, architecture, furniture, pottery, archival documents, photographs, and paintings. Although Bell has worked within the genre of more conventional monumental forms, as exemplified in her collaborative project with Danish Trinidadian artist Jeanette Ehlers, in which they created a 23-foot-tall statue of Mary Thomas, leader of the 1878 St. Croix labor revolt, the first public statue of a Black woman in Denmark, I choose to linger instead on a more abstract rendering of the same uprising. It is not in spite of, but because of the statue's fidelity to the genre of historic representational form and permanence that Bell's parallel studies in ephemeral mobile installations take on new counter-monumental meaning. Constructed manumissions consist of several small wooden houses. Their pale forms exhibit the ornate building embellishments made popular in the town of Frederiksted, St. Croix, during its reconstruction after the fire-burn labor revolt. During the uprising in which plantation workers protested deplorable wages and working conditions, nearly 100 people were killed and 50 plantation houses burned to the ground. Almost 900 acres of sugar were destroyed. These storied scaffoldings thus memorialize the revolt, caught between dual processes of destruction and unfinished regeneration in space and in memory. The structures also reference the designs of working class and free Black communities who negotiated their freedoms in the colonial era through the cultivation of sovereign domestic space, yet remained vigilant of the need for mobility as a survival strategy. Made without frames or glue, they are held together with small metal pins and their own weight, representing autonomy and precarity at once. Made entirely of the ornamental fretwork designs ordinarily featured as architectural flourish, the pattern embellishments form the structure itself, standing alone as substantive and self-sufficient manifestations of the imagination, planning, and technique. At the same time, the predominating negative space observed between the ornate planks signal the house's uninhabitability. Thus, constructed manumissions also spatialize the corrupted promissory note of manumission, distinct from emancipation as an untenable infrastructure which negotiates within but never challenges the governing premise of slavery. Extending her dialogue with the architectural fretwork as encoded language in the built world, another series entitled Cuts and Burns employs fretwork cutouts as stencils to burn ghostly inscriptions into scrolls of paper. This material testimony chronicles the agricultural instruments and processes of the machete and the fire used to cut cane and burn its waste in the process of producing rum and sugar, reappropriated as tools of resistance. Written in fire, the scrolls record the uprisings of the unfree, not as reactive randomized eruptions in the landscape, but as agential and collectively organized systems of dissent. Resembling the ebb and flow of waves, the markings move in many directions, and though contained in a pattern, they record many irregularities, emphasizing the particular within the collective. From a distance, the long scroll reads like an official ledger, contract, or declaration, with each hole recording an absent presence in the archive. Up close, populated with scorched clusters of orderly violence, they mimic the tomb-like blueprint of the slave ship. Placing these surfaces under the microscope and enlarging their gestures, patterns, and narrative capacities, Bell's incendiary architectures defamiliarize to reimagine the edifices, instruments, and testimonies of Black survival and protest. The multiply coded fretwork necessitates the close reading of the built world, passages in both space and historical narrative through which we must carefully traverse. Describing the realization of her massive sculptural rebuttal to the Victoria Memorial outside Buckingham Palace, American artist Carol Walker refers to herself as an unreliable narrator. In light of this admission, which is also a lesson in the simultaneous curiosity, suspicion, and complicity required to engage meaningfully with the work, I explore the monumental fountain as an encrypted counter-archive of imperial fallacies and fallibilities. White text on a gray brick wall in Tate Modern's Turbine Hall provides the exhibition statement, which is also the unabridged title of Carol Walker's The Fons Americanus, the Daughter of the Waters, an allegorical wonder. The prelude to the American source offers as much to its readers regarding the imperial legacies of exhibition as the sculpture itself. Typographically, the floor-to-ceiling composition mirrors the grand scale of the White Fountain, aggregating many fonts and sizes and spacing them variously as the letters cascade down the wall, transforming text into flowing ornament. Hyperbolically exceeding the descriptive purpose of the exhibition primer, the text becomes an ekphrastic encounter with imperial monumentality. Its tone is both solemn and vociferous, punctuated with the bombastic solicitations of a carnival barker, daring one and all to come witness, marvel, and contemplate exotic phenomena. Visitors are implored to gasp plaintively, sigh mournfully, and gaze knowingly, placing the fountain squarely in an active and reactive social arena, and yet such forcefully prescriptive cues instructing viewers' predetermined roles and effective outcomes foreclose the possibility of a spontaneous response. Before a single visitor has set foot in the gallery space, the viewer has been coercively assembled and deemed a failed witness to its offerings. Thus begins Walker's extended choreography of monumental misremembering. Inviting visitors to sit on the edge of the fountain's lower rim, the experiential design of the exhibition rehearses the casual ways in which many viewers of the Victoria Memorial do not simply stand in reverence, but play and rest in its shadows, seeming to passively coexist with the narrative space it produces. However, unlike the Victoria Memorial, which expresses spatial continuity with the planned artery of the Mall, along which many other monuments reside, Fawn stands as the lone transplant. Moreover, where Victoria's many stairs and courtyard provide a multitude of spaces for gathering and sitting, Walker's invitation to sit is more performative than practical. Less a bench and more a precarious ledge, one cannot collapse into the solidity of Pentelic marble, but must perch tentatively. The fountain's thin lip welcomes and strictly delimits participation, exhibiting an urban planning technique instrumentalized in hostile or defensive architectural designs, such as the Camden Bench. This concept of hostile architecture is echoed in the fountain's shark-infested waters that defend the fountain's central pictorial narratives, crowned by a wounded nursing figure, the daughter of the waters, with her head thrown back as she bleeds from a gash in her throat and lactates. These openings form a trinity through which the waters of Africa, Europe, and the Americas flow. Through this grotesque aggregate of hostile built forms and contaminated imageries, Walker's anti-monument exposes the imperial monument as an architectural technology of durable disciplined space, simultaneously betrayed by empire's own unstoppable flows and violent secretions. The visual noise of its many adulterated references is then amplified by the sound of the swirling drama. The sound of rushing water, ordinarily dispersed outdoors or subdued by competing street sounds, is contained in the hall to produce a chorus of white noise. Echoes and mists envelop the viewer in what Walker calls the miasma of conflicts, racial, economic, and cultural. Here, the noxious historical amnesia, ordinarily sealed within the imperial monument, is released, breathed into the body, and also exhaled. In the period since I began thinking with these counter-monumental forms, Colston's statue has been toppled and flung into the Bristol Harbor. The fate of many more imperial shrines have yet to be decided. As Glissant notes, one of the most disturbing consequences of colonization is the enshrinement of a single totalizing history. This is the foundational myth upon which the imperial monument elevates the singular exceptional protagonists of its unified mission. The struggle against this single history continues, but distinct from a model which seeks to bring visibility or give voice to underrepresented histories by way of new monuments without questioning the very apparatus of monumentality, the counter-monuments' alternative methodologies of display and engagement illuminate the ruling political and aesthetic rubrics that govern space and discipline the imagination. Lingering with the colossal commemorative forms that often inure us to the very histories they claim to memorialize, these artists make newly accessible empire's most enduring narratives and reproducible spatial techniques. They avail us to empire's vast memorial occupation, ever in search of new fortifications, but also subject to the will of our collective refusal. Thank you.
Okay, well, another another really great paper there. Thank you so much, Julia. Some of the phrases that stood out for me, some of the methodologies again that came up. I mean, this idea of monumental misremembering sounds like that's something that I'd be really suitable to do in my own personal life. But no, there's lots of, I think this idea of counter monumentalism as being a struggle against a kind of singular history is something that I think we can bring into our panel discussion. So our final paper in what has been a fantastic session so far is by Natalie Maguire-Batson. And the paper is called Relational Research Methodology in Caribbean Museology. Natalie Maguire-Batson's curatorial work engages community-driven discourse in culture through research in Caribbean museology. Having completed a BA in History of Art at the University of Leicester in 2010 and an MA in Museums and Cultural Heritage at the University of Auckland, New Zealand in 2013, she's currently a PhD candidate in Cultural Studies at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. She has a focus on Anglophone Caribbean museology. Natalie is the curator for social history and engagement at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and currently serves as a member on the boards for the Barbados National Art Gallery and ICOFOM LAC, as well as Public Relations Officer for ICOM Barbados. She is the co-curator of the biennial new media exhibition, Transoceanic Visual Exchange, and is founder of the online platform Caribbean Museum Toolkits. I'm looking forward very much to hearing the paper from Natalie. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and a huge thank you to the organizing committee of this symposium for the opportunity to exchange research and happenings across the Caribbean and diaspora. My name is Natalie Maguire-Batson, and I'm going to be sharing with you my ongoing doctoral study into Anglophone Caribbean museology, with a particular focus on relational research methodology. Community inclusiveness in museum theory and practice can take on many forms, but arguably the underlying connection between these is the recognition of the value of putting community voice and participation at the forefront of museum design and practice. This is particularly significant in a Caribbean context. In Caribbean discourse, Édouard Glissant disrupts Western hierarchies of national unity and identity through a series of interventions into philosophy. The confinements of post-colonial meaning-making are challenged by suggesting that identities in the Caribbean are not fixed to a singular essence, unity, or place, but on multiplicities and continual cultural encounters. A concept with which to navigate this comes in the form of rhizomes. Glissant draws on the concept of a rhizomatic approach to identity, primarily from Deleuze and Guattari. They interrogate that meaning-making is rhizomatic, that there are multiple points of communication to create meaning, and that to produce ways of knowing is to assemble, to move away from the hierarchical notion of interpretation as a linear act. Glissant summarizes his use of their rhizome as seen in this slide. Similarly, museology arguably has been relational, being essentially an interdisciplinary field, which studies the relationships between man, objects, and scenarios, such as seen in the work of Brazilian museologist Waldir Ruscio. My research assembles inquiries into community inclusiveness within museological practices in Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago, terminology used in that practice, and research outputs in museum spaces, and by investigating a new tool based on the concept of rhizomes for museological research. Although the field of Anglophone Caribbean museology has been growing, modes of representation within Caribbean museums have often fixated on retaining colonial stories or constructing post-colonial identities. Museums as modern institutions have a policy history tied to colonialism, taking form in the late 18th and early 19th century Europe as entities to showcase objects conquered and collected, an analogy perhaps with the nations themselves which were conquered and collected. With movements of independence, the post-colonial museum in these spaces developed in part to become constructs of national identity and strive to integrate the changing cultural makeup while serving communities in order to remain relevant. But how have narratives around community agency and museology been reflected within museum research in the Caribbean? Caribbean museologists such as Donna McFarlane and Alessandra Cummins comment on the Eurocentric bias in museum exhibition display and the need to address Caribbean-based practices within new museology. The increased interest in community museum research, as well as significant events such as the 1972 Roundtable of Santiago in Chile, sparked a shift in museum praxis, where the emphasis on internal aspects such as the size of collections diminished, and consideration of external aspects such as how they function to serve the communities they represent increased. The decolonization of museology, however, still has a long way to go. My research proposes to offer a study that hopes to broaden the possibilities of how museum work is done in the Anglophone Caribbean and can be theorized beyond already existing Eurocentric models or frameworks. The basis for using a rhizomatic research approach to museology is the recognition that the knowledge production is not apolitical, and so actively developing a methodology to decentralize authority within the creation and archiving of museum theory presents alternate possibilities for knowledge sharing within the case studies of the Anglophone Caribbean. Here I propose a rhizomatic research approach within museums, which best aligns with post-critical museological theory and can be outlined through the following principles. Multivocality in museum research and practice through assemblage. Multivocality functions to delinearize authority within meaning making. Therefore, knowledge exchange between the museologist, researcher, curator, publics, and communities are lateral and relational, rather than hierarchical and fixed. Research methodology is a relational ecology rather than a linear framework. This suggests that museological research be relational and transformative, rather than aim to carve out linear frameworks for museum research and practice. It facilitates micro-level case study research over large-scale survey projects, interrogates definitions, demonstrates sustainable relationship building with museum theory, rather than data collection. And accessible research outputs. Ideally, these are community-led and reflexive. This includes the creation and continual revision of toolkits and aids for museum practitioners and communities as active products of research projects shared across open access platforms. These principles were implemented in my ongoing project in the PhD Cultural Studies program at UWI in Barbados. Sites of research include post-colonial institutions, as well as artist-led initiatives and community-run cultural spaces. The breadth of this reach was to examine the notion of a relational cultural ecology, both within the countries, but also through networks that exist across the countries. In the spaces of knowledge sharing, participants were videoed or videoed themselves responding to questions in the context of museums. One of these was, what does the term community mean to you? And I'll now play a short clip of 4 responses to that term community out of roughly 25 sessions conducted.
There's a quote, an African proverb that goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So that's community in a nutshell. If we don't go together, we will not get far. We won't get anywhere. We'll get there really fast, but it'll be destroyed just as fast going by yourself.
Well, this community is connected through arts. The people that I know that come here, the people that make this space available, and people that, do things here are all connected through art or music, because there's also a band room here. So basically it's a common, common and community. So there's a common action, a common sort of thing that we're all involved in that connects us. And this is a space that is made available for people to participate in those things.
I think of a group of people who are like-minded, who could be related or not related, but they enjoy each other's company, they have similar backgrounds, and I'd say definitely in the Caribbean community usually tends to mean or is surrounded by food and drink of some sort, and stories and laughter.
That's a tricky question. It's so, because I don't think there's a singularity in terms of what constitutes community. I think growing up in the Caribbean, one moves between many spaces, and those spaces kind of shape you, and you shape those spaces as well.
Under the principles of a rhizomatic research approach, the aims of the knowledge sharing sessions were not to construct any definition of community relations in the museum space. Here, the approach is used through the principle of multivocality, the community voices at the forefront of understanding the term community, a term that is heavily saturated in literature regarding inclusion and agency within museums. There was an attempt to reduce any research or authority placed on unpacking the responses from participants to this term, instead enabling them to be the agency that impacts the term. And I want to run through some of the accessible outputs that were part of this research. First, there was Research Yard. This was a pop-up community reading room facilitated during my time and residence at Alice Yard in 2018. The project was born out of informal conversations in the yard around a lack of access to critical texts within arts and culture in the Caribbean and internationally. This prompted a collaborative idea for an open day at Alice Yard. Cultural practitioners, artists, cultural collectives, and academics were invited to share texts from their personal libraries, selected by them based on topics within discourse they were currently interested in. The second project I'd like to look at is artistic interventions. And here we see the intersection between theory and practice is quite prominent, as this project was developed both within my role as a PhD candidate and as a curator at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. Members of the Barbadian creative community were invited to critically engage with the museum's collections through a series of interventions. 6 visual artists responded, and their works were interwoven in the museum's galleries, interrogating and recontextualizing the historical narratives on display. This project followed a long-standing tradition of the Barbados Museum welcoming interventions into its collections and raised important questions about how we can decolonize the narratives on display, particularly with regards to plantation and enslavement. For example, one of the key issues raised through this project was the still perceived lack of equitable representation in our fine art galleries, as Lenore Aline, one of the participating artists, describes in this video.
And I was really affected by the Canard Gallery because it showed a very plantation, it represented plantation life across the region. And so that stuck with me. And as I was making the sugarcane pieces, Agostino Brunius's prints were very much in my mind. I was making those pieces because I didn't feel that the work, the prints and the lithographs that were included in that collection really reflected the life of the slaves or the enslaved or even the free mulattoes that were in that society. So I wanted to just give another side to that, where these enslaved people, these people that you didn't see in these lithographs, did have a life, did have a sexual life as well, and a hidden life that would not necessarily have even come to Bernice's mind to depict in the way he does.
Although not officially under the remit of my doctoral research, I also wanted to highlight a second exhibition at the Barbados Museum, where examples of how I attempt to integrate my research inquiries into my practice as a curator can also be seen. The Black Presence, Activism and Agency in a Different Age was held from February 2020 to October 2021 and examined the context of Black portraiture and imagery from the 18th to the 20th centuries. It focused on a presence or visibility in a time when erasure of existence and cultural aesthetics were perpetuated through the system of enslavement, and the exhibition insisted on a space to highlight individual realities through the tangible nature of paint. Applying the lens of activism and agency, these paintings, prints, and etchings from a private collection of Father Charles Card Reynolds and the Barbados Museum's own collections prompted deeper inquiries into the content, production, and dissemination of Black portraiture, and the parameters of portraiture as an artistic form. From examining artworks as visual data to investigating often overlooked personal histories of people featured in the works, the Black Presence exhibition encouraged a multivocal approach to understanding the role visual art can play in sharing and disrupting historical narratives within museums. Multivocality existed within the co-curatorial framework of the exhibition, asking the question of who can generate meaningful interpretations of collections. This included myself and the Barbados Museum's education officer, Kay Hall, as co-curators, as well as Father Charles Card Reynolds as a collector. It then extended into the exhibition and beyond in the following ways. Local contemporary artists were invited to preview the exhibition and share their thoughts on the works and themes on video. This video was part of the display itself and intended to add another layer to interpretation alongside the curatorial text from the institution. Visitors were able to take selfies with the piece The New York Hairdresser and share these on social media, decentralizing the usual restrictions on photography and fine art galleries. And visitors could also write or doodle on a large community board in the exhibition. And then finally, Peter Brathwaite in his Getty Museum Challenge series also responded to one of our included works by recreating the painting in his own work. In addition to these physical projects, I established a sharing website of toolkits for Caribbean Museum practitioners. Caribbean Museum Toolkits is a free, adaptable, and shareable resource for practitioners and publics across all cultural spaces in the region, and hopes to act as a sustainable repository and encourage open access exchange of resources. As the discipline of museology continues to be navigated and decolonized, institutional understanding of community needs and the roles of representation in a national identity context will no doubt expand. This research is not intended to suggest that a rhizomatic approach to museology should be held as a singular or defined ideal framework. Rather, it is another exploration of possibilities for broadening the scope of understanding Caribbean museology. There is no all-encompassing model for better inclusion that can guarantee an idyllic museum-community relationship applicable to every research process. It could be, however, that the future of understanding what museology is lies not in the boundaries of museum practice, but in a shifting ecology of multiple entry and exit points of encounter between museums and their communities. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion portion of this panel.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much, Natalie, for that really rich paper, and it was just really great to take us. You took us really into the world of Caribbean museology, and it was just really great to hear some voices from the Caribbean as well. So can I ask you, all of our panelists, to now switch on your cameras and join us for our virtual roundtable, and also just to, as we start the conversation, can I also remind our audience to put your questions, in the Q&A function. I'm sure there's many questions. So panelists, thank you so much. That was fire. That was just like, there was so much there that, we could spend the next, I'm sure, 10 hours discussing this. But what came across was this, actually, to use Natalie term of toolkits, it felt like there was an array of toolkits, strategies, tactics, collective actions from across different geographies and locations, or different conjunctures, to use Stuart Hall's term, that we can kind of draw on to rethink, to kind of engage this question, to defend, as I mentioned, the kind of Foucauldian injunction to defend. He talks about defending society, but to defend public culture. So let me start with Ghislaine, because Ghislaine, you obviously, your paper talked about Stuart Hall's engagement with the visual and the visual imagination and the work of artists. And of course, you are central yourself to that particular journey, and obviously continuing with the Stuart Hall Foundation. My question, which I'd sent to you all before, was around this idea of praxis, this idea of, you know, how we, as Malini talked about, translating theory and ideas into embodied practice. I mean, what I wanted to do really, before we start unpacking the points that come out of your papers, is to kind of think about your own practice or your own praxis. And I'm talking to all of you here, not just Ghislaine. I'm going to start with Ghislaine, but I'm thinking to all of you as art historians, as museologists, in Ghislaine's case, you know, as a curator, researcher, writer. Obviously, Stuart Hall has played a really important role, I know, in your own practice and praxis. Can you maybe just say a little bit more about that, about how Stuart's work, his thought, his actions, and his ideas has kind of helped you navigate that thorny field of public culture, right? Where we, and also, you know, in the way that it's changed over time. I mentioned, you know, we've had, you know, 40 years of neoliberalism, and now kind of populism and you know, authoritarianism, in which we have to really think about how we defend public culture. So I just wondered, what kinds of what do you have in your toolkit, and how were they related to Stuart's ideas? Sorry, that was a really long way of saying that.
Ooh, that's a big question. Well, I think the first thing to say is this idea of conjuncture, you know, and not thinking about the moment we're in as somehow definitive, but actually to think about moments when there are profound shifts and changes in society as kind of multifaceted, uneven, and contradictory. So, you know, I wanted to talk about the 1970s because there are so many continuities from the 70s into the current times we're living in. So we mustn't think of this as something entirely new that we're living with now. This is a continuation of a shift into kind of global capital, and these reactionary modes were things that began, you know, some time ago. The other thing is to be looking for the points of resistance, which I think a number of my colleagues on the panel, I think, did brilliantly, to actually identify where those dissenting voices are, where those, you know, as you put very well, Paul, how we can find different methodologies and ways to think differently, imagine differently, reconvene public culture in a myriad of different ways that go against the grain of the current political trajectory. That was one thing. The other thing I want to say was really about, you know, just going back to that shift that I described, that Stuart reflects on, the struggle from relations of representation to the politics of representation itself, and what that means in terms of public culture and in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter protests, which a number of people have referenced. You know, it's really important that Black artists are present in the programme of museums and galleries. It's really important that there are more Black curators and cultural workers. It's really important that there are more Black audiences, greater numbers of Black people involved, engaged, participating. But it's not enough, you know? It's not enough, because we've got to go further, and we need to have a different, and I think our last speaker was articulating this very well. we need a different intellectual and political framework for cultural institutions which change structurally and systemically how these institutions operate, from how they're funded, how they're governed, to the discourses they promote. And I think that's what, I think we can get from thinkers like Stuart Hall and Édouard Glissant and Sylvia Wynter, is, how it's not enough to imagine a different world. We have to bring it into being, and that means structural and systemic change at a fundamental level, not just cosmetic change.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it just reminds me of Marx's 11th thesis, Feuerbach's 11th thesis about, the point is not to interpret the world, the point is to change it. I think is what you're saying there, Jelaine. Thank you so much for that. Can I go to Malini now? And Malini, I'm going to sort of ask you the same question as well. And in terms of you thinking about your practice, as an analyst of cinema, a writer, researcher, how have you the work that you mentioned, really powerfully exemplified the questions that we were talking about, some of the methodologies. I mean, have you, in terms of some of the Colleen Smith's methodologies, for example, which I thought were really interesting, about the materiality of metaphors, materializing the metaphors. Have you applied that in your own scholarship, research, practice?
So not quite yet. This is a brand new research project for me, but I can tell you where it's coming from in terms of my turn to thinking about praxis. So it comes from two kinds of dissatisfaction. So me feeling a little bit dissatisfied with my own practice as a writer. And this is something I haven't been able to name properly until recently. And so, talking to artists and also reading the work of Dylan Robinson, Avery Gordon, Fred Moten, Stefano Harney, I'm starting to see that I am tired of always writing about something. And so I would like to think about what it means to write with something or to write for something. And so I'm undertaking experiments in this regard, but there's a process of translation involved there. So that's one place where this is coming from. And the other has to do with thinking about pedagogy as praxis from a studies point of view and wanting to think beyond the way we typically think about these things in a studies context. So I feel like experiential learning, like that's the big buzzword now. And it feels like it means internships mostly. And that's fine, but it feels like that's mostly what it means. Or this idea of, you see this sometimes in film history, for example, this gesture of, imagine you went back to a different historical moment and you read some primary sources and, try to imagine yourself back in a different moment in history. Like say you were a screenwriter in the 1920s, right? And that being a lure to look at archival materials and to do historical research. So I don't have a problem with any of these things, but I'm wondering what else is there? What else could we be doing? Especially someone like me who works on cinema, how can I draw from cinema to try to develop praxis-oriented methodologies? So that's those places of dissatisfaction is where this work is coming from, and I'm still thinking through where this is going to go in terms of my own teaching.
Wonderful, thank you. I love that quote that you mentioned in the talk from, I think it was from Kodjo Eshun, about reading or Black study as a form of self-defense, and also Colleen's injunction, talking metaphor about reading as a form of inoculation, about we need to inoculate ourselves, taking the present context. Before I let you go, Aline, there's another question for you that's come through from a colleague of mine at UAL, Saldana, and she says, thanks for your talk, really wonderful. They were all wonderful talks, he says, right? Performativity with the book is a powerful methodology which can also extend to actions or makings of the book itself, including, as you say, the act of making public the book. So the question is, do you have any further views on this topic, particularly in the context of seeking radical pedagogies? So this idea of, of the book as methodology, if you like.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I've been thinking about it since I've seen it, since I saw it pop up. I don't have maybe the best answer for it because I haven't been thinking about this for that long, to be honest. But your question made me think about reading groups. So for example, Colleen Smith, so not the human _ 3.0 reading list, but another work that she made called the Black Feminist Loner Library. And it similarly features drawings of book covers. There was a book club that developed alongside of that work. And so it was interesting to read about that book club and to read that the people running the book club thought that it could exist independently of Smith's work, as though Smith's work was not necessary to the book club other than providing a potential list of readings. So you've heard my paper, so I find that problematic. I think there's more that needs to be done here. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, and this is not my idea, this is an idea that I've read about by author Dylan Robinson in a book called Hungry Listening, where he talks about something called performative writing. And it names something that I was talking about before, how you can write with or for something instead of simply writing about something, which would mean adopting the methodologies that you might find in the work that you're looking at. And so part of me thinks, that could be interesting in a reading club scenario. I don't know if that counts as radical pedagogies or not, but it's praxis oriented. And I think, and it's about iteration as well, which is something I was talking about in my paper. So part of me thinks maybe that's a kind of work that could be done in a reading group circumstance. So that's the answer I have for you, but maybe my colleagues here or anybody else in the audience might have a different answer for you. But thank you for that question.
Thank you, Malini. Great, Julia. I guess the same kind of question for you in terms of praxis and methodology, strategies, tactics, and yeah, just the way, your take on Hugh Locke's ornamental spoliation, I think you called it, as a methodology of thinking about the way he refigures or reconfigures colonial histories or singular colonial histories embodied in monuments, and thinking that monuments are really at the center of much of the current conjuncture, if you like, around and debates around public culture. Yeah, in terms of how does that kind of reflect, how is that kind of reflected in your own work, as an art historian, as a writer?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I feel like I'm learning so much about new methods from this conversation and from the previous panelists. It's been so enriching for me. I mean, the way that I think about praxis is collaboration that is, rigorous, but also often at the edge of one's own sort of expertise, pushing oneself to that uncomfortable space. But I've been thinking about, praxis and public culture and what collaboration has meant during the time of, of this Zoom space. And, during this period in which many of us were only able to connect via these means, our sense of conspiratorial joy was kind of lost because there wasn't an opportunity for an aside, for a kind of peripheral conversation to be blooming. We were our sense of the public was restricted to this kind of productive space of Zoom, to the kind of market time of that. And I feel like this need for conspiratorial joy and for that kind of collaboration has just been enlivened during this time for me. And I'm just so, it's something that I'm going to continue to think about implementing in new ways once I'm, able to be more consciously back in the space where you can have these little asides. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Yeah.
Sure. And we, in the World in Public Cultures project, we've been grappling with the same kind of issue about how to share and work collectively, online as well. So you're right. It's, again, public culture and public space is much, is more and more virtual, more and more about, how do we, in some respects, those tools give us more opportunities to share and to work together, but they also can be incredibly distancing at the same time. Yeah. Thanks, Natalie. I guess I would, 2 parts. First, your response to this praxis question, which I think you've kind of addressed in a way in your paper, but there's also a question from Shani Roper for Natalie about community. How have the community interventions and the increased participation of the audience in exhibition spaces, both social media and in person, received by colleagues, or how is it received by colleagues in light of the fact that museums and galleries, state-run institutions in the Caribbean, are not seen as community-centered or disrupting class dynamics?
Thanks, Paul. It's really wonderful to be here with everybody this afternoon. Regarding practice, I think I did touch a little bit about connecting practice with theory. But within the history of museology in the global north, especially French schools of thought, theory's always been generated first, and then that informs practice within the museum spaces. Caribbean museology, I think, has a different potential to articulate theories from practices that already exist, but are often invisible on the academic discourse of museology. So in the Anglophone Caribbean and English-speaking Caribbean, for example, there's only a small set of scholarship on museology as a kind of pure theory. So with a rhizomatic approach, I'm attempting to give this museological voices to some of these practices that my colleagues are implementing across the region, but at the same time questioning the frameworks that theories traditionally developed in. How relevant is it to our Caribbean experiences to continually follow these epistemologies that were formed in the global north? And I think this lateral approach, rather than the traditional kind of top-down approach, speaks to Glissant's notion of rhizomes, with growth being through multiple entry and exit points, as opposed to growth being very linear, top-down. So I hope that expands a little bit about the praxis question. And Shani, thank you so much for your question, and hello. I think that is a very interesting point to raise regarding the engagement with our museum colleagues across the network in the Caribbean region. I think for the most part there is a openness to shift some of these very rigid colonial practices in our institutions. The Barbados Museum we're a little bit different because we're not entirely a state-run museum. So we do have a little bit more independence with that regard, but I know also with some of the state-run institutions, there is still a lot of unlearning of these colonial models of gatekeeping, of collecting, of focusing on the object rather than on interaction and engagement with communities that still needs to be done even in our own context here in the Caribbean.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie. We're kind of rounding up soon, but before we do that, I wanted to just, because I mean, some of the ideas that you've presented, everyone presented, the strategies, ideas, are so expansive. And I wondered whether, I want to ask you a quick question. It's a big question. I've only got like 2 minutes to answer it, but I'm just wondering, like, the imperative to decolonize museums, which museums themselves are now taking on board, or not only museums, universities, cultural institutions. Decolonization is now apparently the thing that we're meant to do, right? But so I'm just wondering, how does that fit with these kind of expansive relational methodologies that you've talked about? So, for example, Julia, with your wonderful analysis of Carver Walker, and about the kinds of monumental misrememberings that were encoded in the work. But of course, that at the Tate, but of course that work it was in a public space, but it was within the walls of the museum. I mean, what would have been interesting to see what that would have been like in the Trafalgar Square, for example. So I'm just wondering, in terms of how, what you think, whether you think decolonization actually captures what we're really trying to do with this work. Just very briefly, if we go around, I'll start with you, Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's something that I'm very actively thinking about, because different institutions, where I'm headed to Cambridge soon, and that's something that has been discussed in some radical ways and in some modest ways. But I've just been thinking about, so in terms of decolonization, in terms of the text that we're reading, I just think it's really important to connect always back to the context in which we're reading them. I'm thinking about, for example, right at the institution I'm at right now, Caltech. Caltech is dealing with the renaming of its library system because of its ties to the history of eugenics in the US. And in a course where I'm teaching a course on heritage, co-teaching it. It was really important for us to tie in what's happening in this institution to really understand how the sort of spatial and institutional forces in which we reside and study these monuments, these sort of heritage figures and figuration, how they're related. So I think it's about making sure that those things are connected, so that students feel like they can locate themselves in these arguments and spaces of contestation within their studies and in their material lived experience on campus and beyond.
Thank you. Ghislaine? Thank you, Julia. Ghislaine? You're muted, Ghislaine. Sorry. Thank you.
I feel there's just been such a heavy, oppressive weight of silence around colonization, histories of slavery, that I think decolonization feels too flippant in a way, in some ways, too much. How can we decolonize when we haven't really, dug deep and, done that work of unearthing what that legacy of colonialism and slavery has been? So that's not to say there aren't important things being done under the banner of decolonization, really important things. But I feel that we mustn't think that that is sufficient to rename a building, to move a statue. That is an important gesture and action, but in and of itself, it's not sufficient hard work to really bring to the surface and to public understanding what that colonial history really involved and what its legacy is.
Thank you, Ghislaine. Malini?
So decolonization's a word I try not to use. And this is a question of where I am and where I am located. I am on Indigenous lands. So following, Eve Tuck and K-Wei Yang, until, decolonization means land back in this context. That's where it means where I am. So I can't see my work through that lens. I like the word anti-colonial, trying that out for a while and see if that might be better in terms of where I'm located, whether that is a more productive term to use. And I think, going back to these metaphors that I was talking about, inoculation, self-defense, these strike me as being compatible with thinking about anti-colonial forms of education and action. So, yeah.
Yeah, we like anti-colonial, definitely. Thank you so much, Malini. And last word to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean, Natalie.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, as Malini said, anti-colonial definitely has more of a feel of action towards it. And following on the same vein as everybody who's spoken before, for me, it really depends on who is defining decolonization and the success criteria for it. In a museum context, if we're embracing decolonization or anti-colonial practices as a continual reflexive process, then it does have the potential to really democratize the space and address these issues of citizenship that are still prominent in our post-colonial and neo-colonial realities, especially here in the Anglophone Caribbean. But if it's identified as a checklist or a destination, then as Jelaine was mentioning, it's not really sufficient as a term.
Wonderful, wonderful way to end. Thank you so much. Before I say thank you to our esteemed panel for that fire panel, just to remind you all that tomorrow, our session, the conference continues tomorrow, so please log on again with panel 4 starting Caribbean Worldings at 3:30. So please, and more information is in the chat. So I'd just like to say, thank you all of you for the generosity of your responses, for the expansiveness. I think you did provide, at least for me, a box of tools that I can definitely delve into and think anti-colonial tools, not decolonization, not state-led decolonization tools that we can work with and think with in the World in Public Culture Project and beyond. So thank you all, to Jelaine, to Julia, to Malini, and to Natalie. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks to the panel. Okay.
Thank you for your brilliant chairing, Paul.
Jelaine.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, totally.
Thanks everyone for coming, for watching.